Indigenous Rights Radio, because knowledge is power.
You are now listening to Cultural Survival's Global News Bulletin. Every month, Cultural Survival brings you the latest news impacting indigenous peoples across the globe. This November edition features important stories from Europe, North, Central, South America, Africa, Asia, and beyond. On the global front, in a landmark decision, the UN Biodiversity Conference in Cali, the summit, officially known as the 16th Conference of the Parties to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, in short, the COP16 agreed to establish a subsidiary body giving indigenous peoples a formal voice in nature conservation decisions. This move recognizes their crucial role in protecting land and biodiversity. The newest subsidiary body translates into a permanent space for indigenous peoples and local communities to participate in decision-making on biodiversity. This space will also strengthen dialogue between countries, indigenous peoples, and local communities to define actions that contribute to protecting nature. The summit concluded after 12 days of robust discussion among 170 delegations. It also achieved a breakthrough agreement requiring corporations to share profits from research using natural genetic resources. 50% of a new fund will be directed towards indigenous communities. While celebrating these victories, concerns remain over the lack of financial commitments to address the urgent biodiversity crisis. The pledges at COP16 fell drastically short of the billions needed, raising concerns on the UN climate talks COP19 in Azerbaijan. In the US, President Joe Biden issued a historic apology on behalf of the United States to indigenous Americans for the harm inflicted by federal Indian boarding schools. Speaking at the Gila River Indian community, Biden acknowledged the suffering Native children endured due to government policies that separated them from their families and communities. At these federal boarding schools, children were often subjected to harsh anti-indigenous indoctrination, abuse, and neglect, and many died as a result. John Ichohok, executive director of the Native American Rights Fund, praised the apology and urged further action, particularly around repatriating remains under the Native American Grapes Protection and Repatriation Act. Ichohok highlighted the ongoing trauma within indigenous communities and the need for the federal cooperation to support healing. This apology follows the Biden administration's 2021 investigation into the abuse of the boarding school era, marking a key moment in the U.S. tribal relations and historical reckoning. In Indonesia, Gustina Salim Rambe, a mother from North Sumatra, has been sentenced to over 5 months in prison for protesting a palm oil factory operating next to 2 schools. The factory, owned by PT Pulau Pudang Sawit Parmei, illegally blankets the area with air pollution, impacting the health of some 400 children. Rambe's arrest during a demonstration against the factory sparked outrage, particularly after a video of her confronting her young daughter in jail went viral. Despite parliamentary pressures for restorative justice and existing laws protecting environmental activism, the court convicted Rambe. Civil society organizations argue that the factory violates zoning regulations and that Rambe's protest was a legitimate act of environmental advocacy. They criticize the government's lack of environmental oversight and frequent criminalization of those defending their rights to a healthy environment. This case underscores the challenges faced by the communities across Indonesia struggling against the negative impacts of the palm oil industry, despite legal protection for environmental defenders. In India, a woman was killed and over 10 houses burned in renowned ethnic clashes in Manipur's Jairon Hamar village. The Indigenous Tribal Leaders Forum accuses Meitei militants of the attack and criticizes both the Manipur and Indian governments for failing to curb violence and protect Kuki-Jo communities. Concerns are rising over the growing presence of Meitei militants in Kuki areas and the potential for the conflict to engulf the hitherto neutral Naga community. Despite peace talks initiated by the Union Home Affairs Ministry, violence continues, with tribal groups demanding stronger action against extremist groups and compensation for the victims. In Papua New Guinea's rainforests, home to some of the world's most diverse ecosystems, face severe threats from illegal logging. This environmental crisis is not only causing irreparable damage to biodiversity, but correlates to human rights abuses, with indigenous communities bearing the brunt. Illegal logging operations often encroach on land that is sacred to local tribes, violating their rights and disrupting their way of life. Many indigenous peoples are displaced, and their traditional knowledge of the forest is being disregarded in favor of short-term profit. Rapid deforestation is also aggravating climate change, as these rainforests play a crucial role in carbon sequestration. Environmental groups are calling for stronger enforcement of the laws and greater support for indigenous communities who have been stewards of these forests for centuries. The situation in Papua New Guinea highlights the urgent need to protect both the environment and the rights of indigenous peoples who are on the front line of the fight against deforestation and biodiversity loss. In Tanzania, in a significant moment of cultural restoration, precious Maasai heirlooms have been returned to the Maasai people after being held in foreign collections for decades. The artifacts, which include sacred regalia and other cultural treasures, were taken during the colonial era without the Maasai's consent. Recently, efforts have been intensified to repatriate these items with support from global campaigns, museums, and governments. The return of these items represents not just the return of the material objects, but a deep healing for the Maasai community who have long fought to reclaim their cultural heritage. The artifacts will be safely preserved and displayed, allowing the Maasai to reconnect with their history and strengthen their traditions. This marks a significant victory in the global movement to return cultural property taken during the colonial times. The items were held in Pitt Museum in the UK for many years. In 2018, Maasai representatives visited and identified 5 susceptible items from the collection of 188. These objects are considered family heirlooms passed down through generations and are meant to remain within the family. In Brasilia, indigenous leaders are leading a powerful resistance against ongoing attacks on their constitutional rights. Protesters gathered on 29th and 30th of October to demand that the government uphold protection for indigenous lands and cultures, which have been increasingly threatened by policies favoring agribusiness and illegal land grabs. The protest, organized by Articulation of Indigenous Peoples of Brazil, highlight the ongoing struggle to defend ancestral territories from exploitation and destruction. Indigenous groups argue that these attacks not only violate their constitutional rights but also undermine the environmental and cultural heritage of Brazil. The protests come amid growing concerns that government actions could dismantle crucial protection over the past few decades. Indigenous leaders are determined to continue their fight, echoing the rallying cry, "A luta continua," the struggle continues, as they push for stronger safeguards against encroachment and for the recognition of their rights as Brazil's first peoples. In Mexico, a new report shows the serious dangers for human rights defenders in Mexico. The All Their Names, All Their Struggles project by Iruka Oksaka reports that at least 225 human rights and environmental defenders were murdered during President Andrés Manuel López Obrador's 6-year terms, which ended in October 2024. Among those killed, 141 were Indigenous and Afro-Mexican, pointing out the higher violence faced by these communities. Additionally, 27 defenders were forcibly disappeared during this time. The study recorded a total of 252 attacks against activists, which included disappearances, murders, and extrajudicial killings. Alarmingly, Iruka Oksaka found that the Mexican state is involved in 42 of the murder cases. The report highlights that defending land rights and civil liberties is especially dangerous in Mexico, as these defenders make up 80% of the murder victims. In Guatemala, all 16 mayors in the Zacatepec Department of Guatemala have signed a letter to President Fernando Arevalo in support of Governor Maria Angelina Aspocon. This comes after a Prensa Libre report accused the governor of collecting bribes. Previously, the mayor expressed their confidence in Aspocon during a Council of Departmental Development meeting. They rejected the allegations and praised her transparency and management. Governor Aspocon, who is indigenous, called the accusations defamation and said they are part of a more extensive campaign against the government and its officials. Quote, "I feel calm because I have acted transparent," unquote, she stated. In Colombia, at the UN Biodiversity Conference, COP16 in Cali, Colombia, various organizations called for nature to be recognized as having rights. The Global Alliance for the Rights of the Nature and the Indigenous Women's Biodiversity Network are at the forefront of this effort. They stress the importance of protecting the environment. This recognition would give nature legal protection, helping to prevent harmful activities like reckless resource extraction and mining. Representing the Global Alliance, Juan Acosta urged government to prioritize our planet's health and take care of our common home. Florida Lopez, the regional coordinator of the Indigenous Women's Network, pointed out how vital biodiversity is in Latin America. Throughout COP16, indigenous peoples and their allies are pushing for an end to land exploitation. They want government to honor the right of all living things, rivers, animals, trees, and entire species, to protect them from destruction. In Honduras, the Honduran government, led by President Xiomara Castro, has started to carry out a ruling from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights related to the Gurifuna community in Punta Piedra. This decision comes after months of pressure from Gurifuna activists, who rallied in April to seek action on several Inter-American Court of Human Rights rulings. The court has found Honduras guilty 3 times for violating the rights of Gurifuna communities in Triunfo de la Cruz, Punta Piedra, and San Juan. These violations mainly involved land rights and forced displacement, as developers target Gurifuna's ancestral land for tourism projects. By committing implement Inter-American Court of Human Rights ruling, the government is taking an essential step towards recognizing the rights of Gurifuna people and achieving justice for them. In Argentina is facing a severe food crisis. Poverty is rising sharply, and millions of people are struggling to get necessities. Organizations are calling on the government to set up an emergency food fund to help resolve this urgent problem. A recent study shows that poverty increased by 11.2% in the first half of 2024, leaving over 5 million people unable to afford essential food. This concern links to the policies of President Javier Milei's administration, which has cut 111 public programs related to food access. The study by the Rosa de Luxembourg Foundations and the Center for Legal and Social Studies criticizes the government for removing support for indigenous peasant family farming and stopping state food assistance program. These cuts have hurt healthy food producers and community distribution networks, worsening the crisis and leaving more Argentinians in urgent need. That is all for this edition of Cultural Survival's Global News Bulletin. Stay tuned for our next podcast. For more information on the rights of indigenous peoples, visit cs.org and follow Cultural Survival on Facebook, Instagram, and X.